I mean, God can't get off the hook here. I would take a pretty non-Calvinist stance in the sense that God is not directly responsible for all the suffering that happens in the world. That's just not the way I think it works. But God created a world where such things could happen. And you can lay some of it on the fall, but God created a world where the fall could happen. So finally it's going to land back in God's lap. And there has to be an affirmation of a divine restoration that is so total and so complete that we'll all say, oh, okay, it was better that we were created than that we were not created. I think when you are in the kind of situation that we're in, it really makes you see the weaknesses of traditional theodicy. I mean, you can argue the case that some good stuff will come out of this. That's undoubtedly true. But the burden is going to be disproportionately shared by the most vulnerable people in society, and that they should die so the rest of us can learn some things about family or community or whatever. That's really bad argumentation. And I think, you can't have this discussion. I mean, the question usually gets phrased something like, well, okay, where's God in all this? What's God doing in this? And that's where I think you really do need to shift out of philosophy into theology. And, particularly Christian theology, and your primary sort of it's not going to be an argument, it's going to be an assertion, and that's going to be based around the incarnation. So if it's truly Christian theology, it's always going to be centered in Jesus Christ, and what do we know about God through Jesus. If Hebrews is to be believed, that Jesus is the clearest declaration of who God is, and if John is to be believed, that Jesus is God in the flesh. And so I think the way, for instance, Karl Barth would say it, and he's no friend of theodicy or Christian evidences for sure. He would say, in Jesus Christ, we see God's yes to human beings. And I think that's right. And the most important thing in a time like this would be to say God picked a side, and he picked humanity's side. And he showed that he picked humanity's side by becoming human in Jesus Christ. And I mean, you can look at all sorts of kind of irony is not even a strong enough word. When people were crucified, and I'd be following Fleming Rutledge here, that it is important not just that we have a dying Messiah, but that we have a crucified Messiah. When people were crucified, if they didn't die just from the body trauma, they suffocated. They died for lack of air. And here we are at a time when people are dying for lack of air. They're suffocating. And that's the way the Son of God, or to put it more provocatively, that's the way God died. And so, the fundamental Christian affirmation is that God gets it, that he's entered fully into it. And if you want to know where God is, he's on the hospital wards. He's in those beds dying. He's as close as our own skin. That's what incarnation means. And to me, that would be the fundamental Christian response, is that God isn't sitting on the throne imperiously looking kind of on things, that he's entered fully into the reality and suffers what humanity suffers by his own choice. That is, he picked a side, and he picked humanity's side. I think the other piece is, I mean, you're going all the way back to John Hickey on the God of Love and that sort of stuff, is you can do theodicy either by looking backwards or by looking forwards. And you would want to have some sort of Christian affirmation centered not just in incarnation, but in hope, kind of the second parousia of Jesus Christ. And, I'm kind of working on this problem at the moment. I don't quite have it to my satisfaction yet, but I think that whatever the end is has to be so spectacular that even those who are the victims of just extreme evil or suffering would be able to say at the end that the conclusion made it worth the experience. And that's a fairly extreme case to argue. That's the case I'd want to argue, is that this end, which telos, technical term, that I can't even fully imagine, is going to be so spectacular that we'll all affirm that it was worth the trip, no matter how bad the trip was. So those are the two things that I think would have to go into a theodicy. You'd have to have incarnation, and then you'd have to have the affirmation of God's restoration of all things. It's so total and so complete. I think what goes with that second point, I'm not sure about this, I don't have it worked out. I'm going to have to talk to some other philosophers. I think that people who suffered extraordinarily in this life may have a capacity to appreciate whatever is coming that's beyond mine. I don't even know if it makes any sense to do that kind of a calculus. But whatever the end is, the end, it better be pretty spectacular. One of the things I have increasingly come to appreciate is, in terms to its service to humanity, the church is really pretty remarkable. I get a little irritated at my unbelieving friends who want to point out all the ways that the church falls short of her calling, and I can enumerate those better than they can. But I want to remind them, after Hurricane Katrina, while the government was looking for the keys to the van, the churches rebuilt all the neighborhoods. Church group after church group after church group went down and rebuilt New Orleans, and most people don't bother to mention that. And that's what's happening now. Is in blocks and in small towns and in sections of cities, churches are caring for just dozens and hundreds and thousands of people that we're not even aware of. I have become a CASA volunteer. A CASA volunteer is a guardian ad litem. You represent a child who's been put into the Child Protective Service system for whatever reason. And, I've come to deeply mourn the fact that many of those children have no community at all, no stability at all. And I know some other children like that who, for one reason or another, fumbled or bumbled their way into a church, or a friend brought them, and that community saved their lives. They became the only stable thing in their life. And so, I think in times like this, I think the church generally, it's one of the few times when we play a better game than we talk. And there are certainly a few exceptions to that, but there aren't very many. And if churches quit doing all the things that they're doing right now, everything would fall apart. It's the stuff that you're not seeing, that's not in the newspaper. They're quietly sort of helping people hold things together. And they're also the economic problems on the back end are going to be more than churches can manage. Churches are going to do their part. They're going to provide the bridge and the lifeline for people to get to that next thing. In some ways, it's like the Great Depression, where up until the Great Depression, the churches were the primary social sort of safety net. In the Great Depression, all the churches became so poor that they couldn't supply that net. The government stepped in, has never stepped out. And the government's going to do a lot of it this time too. But churches are going to save lives. And I hope that while we're doing that humanitarian work, we'll also have a gospel word to say, a word about Jesus Christ, about the yes of God, about the hope for the future. Otherwise it's social work, and social work is great work. But I hope we'll wrap our commitment in a message of the yes of God to humanity, because a lot of people are going to feel this is a no. It feels like no, and I think that yes in Jesus Christ is really important for the church to say now.